Already 72% of American teenagers are turning to AI for companionship.
Yeah, I heard you say that on Rogan. It's an amazing statistic.
Yeah, it really is. And, this is a new technology. I mean, in 2022, no one knew what a chatbot was, except people in the industry. This is the fastest uptake of any technology in history. There are already 800 million people, I think, using AI chatbots.
Welcome to Brave New World, the Standards podcast where we explore the cutting edge of science, technology, and the future of humankind. I'm your host, Evgeny Lebedev, and in this series we venture into the frontiers of neuroscience, longevity, consciousness, and the extraordinary breakthroughs reshaping the human experience. Today's guest is Michael Pollan, journalist, author, and one of the leading voices exploring the human mind. His new book, A World Appears, explores one of the biggest questions of all: what is consciousness and what happens when we begin to lose it?
Michael Pollan, welcome to Brave New World. I'm
Pleasure
really
to be here.
Yeah, to have you on. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
A World Appears, a journey into consciousness. And it was quite a journey. I really enjoyed your impassioned defense of consciousness. I guess consciousness in front of humanity squandering it away, but also consciousness in the threat of machines, and potentially machines either gaining consciousness or fooling us.
Yeah, it may not make a difference, but...
May not make a difference, exactly. You describe the ownership of consciousness in a really beautiful way. I think you talk about the space of freedom to explore our mind. Will you just expand a little bit on that?
Yeah. So you mentioned defensive consciousness, and that could have been a subtitle for the book, in defensive consciousness, or a title, because I do feel that it's precious and threatened. It's precious in the sense that we each have this interior space, these voices in our head, and it's a space of complete mental freedom and privacy. We can think whatever we want. And what's worrisome about it is that we're squandering this freedom. We're giving up a lot of our headspace to things like social media. When we hear that social media is hacking our attention, that these algorithms know exactly how to hook us, essentially addict us, and infinite scrolling makes it very hard to stop. Hacking our attention is a central part of consciousness. It's how we choose to aim our consciousness, if you will, target it. So I think that's one thing. I mean, if you think about it, there was a time when you're standing online at the bakery or the cafe, you're waiting. What did you used to do? You used to daydream, mind wander, think about what you're going to have for dinner, think about problems at work you're going to deal with. Now we can't resist. We take out our phone and we fill that space with really what are someone else's thoughts. And I think that situation is about to get a lot worse with chatbots and the kinds of relationships that they are forming with people. Already 72% of American teenagers are turning to AI for companionship.
Yeah, I heard you say that on Rogan. It's an amazing statistic.
Yeah, it really is. And, this is a new technology. I mean, in 2022, no one knew what a chatbot was, except people in the industry. This is the fastest uptake of any technology in history. There are already 800 million people, I think, using AI chatbots. So if social media was hacking our attention, what are these more sophisticated algorithms doing? They're hacking our attachments. Emotional attachment is so central to what it means to be human. And they're getting between us and other people. I mean, you have kids who come home from school and they want to tell their chatbot, they have their friend on their phone, what happened during the day before they tell their parents. And and obviously there are people falling in love with chatbots, and so that's taking up a lot of headspace also.
Why is that? Why do kids choose to talk to the chatbot over their
Well, they're
parents?
kind of ideal friends. They're totally uncritical. They make you feel good by agreeing with you about everything. They're sycophantic. ChatGPT-4 was so sycophantic that it had to be withdrawn. It was leading to very psychotic episodes. There was a case of ordinary people who were convinced they'd solve very important problems of math or physics without any background at all, because they were encouraged to believe that they were brilliant by these machines. So, human relationships have friction to them, right? I mean, we define ourselves by our difference with whoever we're engaging with. We figure out what we think based on that friction too. A completely synthetic, friction-free relationship is not a real relationship. And I think it will have a cost. I think we'll lose our muscles for having real social engagement with other people. And this is so important to who we are. And, forming emotional attachments with a machine, I mean, think about that. I mean, what does the word dehumanizing mean, if not that, right? And but we're going down that path very quickly. And I get the appeal, and I think that, this is a friend that is available 24/7 and doesn't contradict you, and also can answer all sorts of questions. It's really smart. It's appealing, but I think we took a momentous step when we started designing machines that talk to us in our language in the first person, because we were bound to project consciousness onto them. We anthropomorphize everything. It's a deep selective bias. It's been selected for, and it makes sense. If you see a rock and you first think bear, that's the smarter thing to think until you're convinced it's not a bear, because a rock's not going to hurt you, and a bear could hurt you. So that kind of agency bias is really built in, and these machines benefit from that. Obviously when you use a chatbot or you scroll on social media, you are conscious. You have to be conscious to do it, but minimally conscious. And I feel like we're reducing our level of consciousness because we're allowing it to be manipulated.
Do you think people, and maybe it's a difficult question to ask, I'm not sure anyone's done this research, but do you think people are actually thinking about this? My view is that while ironically smartphones are making us dumb, or dumber, probably dumb, AI has potential to make us completely imbecilic. Just not knowing, just not being able to do basic things like
write.
Yeah.
We're going to give up. I mean, yes, we are going to.
There was actually research that was publicized about 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it, but that people's writing or generally writing is becoming more uniform as a result of AI. So even though it's written by individuals, but it's becoming much more uniform than it was about, say, 20 years ago.
And then you have people who are letting AI do all their writing, and they will lose the ability to do it. And that, writing is not just a way to put your thoughts into a form that you can share them. Writing is thinking, right? I mean, I do most of my thinking when I'm writing. It is a process. It enforces a certain discipline mentally. I get more ideas when I'm at the keyboard. And so I can't imagine giving that away to a machine and losing that. So I think it's a misunderstanding of writing that it's simply this translation process or something. It's a way of thinking. And I mean, if you take the example of GPS, for the last 10, 15 years, we've all been using GPS to get around. My son, who grew up with GPS, doesn't know how to use a map. He doesn't understand the geography of the city he lives in, but he can get anywhere he needs to.
That's what I mean, just not being able to do basic things.
Yeah, it's the atrophying of a muscle. And, it gets the job done. He gets where he has to go. but I think something important is lost.
A lot of people in the industry say, well, it gives us possibility to do more time to have do other things.
Right.
But I think that's
We'll see.
That's a bullshit excuse, because actually you do need to be able to do these basic things to remain human. But maybe, going back to my original question, do you think it's people actually stop to consider this, and is it too late? Is it?
You know, there is this air of inevitability that surrounds artificial intelligence that's really striking. I talk to people who work for these companies, and they have genuine alarm about exactly what we're talking about. But they think they're in a race, and there is no choice but to go ahead, because if they don't do it, the other company will do it, and they've got better ethics, so they think it's more important. Everybody thinks they're the ethical one. And then you've got China, of course. You have to compete with China. So we're hurtling into this future that everyone who knows the most about these technologies knows is going to be radically disruptive, is going to make the Industrial Revolution look like nothing, and will come 10 times as fast. And they will tell us that, yes, this is all coming, can't do anything about it. The public's not going to be consulted. There are some very well-intentioned people that I talk to at these companies, but even they feel that their control is minimal.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've spoken to also a number of individuals who are close to governments or actually working inside governments on AI, and that's the consensus, that we can't. We want to try and regulate it, but we can't, because the other guy might win if they get there first, i.e. China.
Yeah, and I think it will be an historical tragedy of great proportions that this technology emerged at a moment when Donald Trump was president, because he has no interest in regulating. And it's not that Biden got it right, but there was a conversation going on of how to put guardrails on this. There was a discussion about slowing it down, but very little discussion about what direction it's going in. And, it's hard to regulate. Government is much slower than industry. But there's some key decisions, I think, that we should take now before it's too late. One is, and this is a very simple one, Yuval Harari has made this point. Basically, you can imitate anybody. They could create an avatar of you saying whatever they wanted and make it, convince people it's real. And ditto with me. We have laws against counterfeiting money. We don't have any laws against counterfeiting people. We should. That seems really basic. Another is, and this flows out of the whole discussion about consciousness in AI, there are people who feel we have to give rights, confer personhood on AI.
I think that's insane.
Absolutely insane. But this is a very active conversation in Silicon Valley that,
I'm sure they'd like it.
Well, it relieves them responsibility, among other things. You have, there are, ChatGPT was, we'll decide what the court decides, but appears to have been responsible for a suicide of a teenager. And the company would like not to be responsible for that, as you can understand. But I think, rights are a human creation, right? We invented rights. They didn't exist in nature. We decide who gets them too, and we've changed that over time. But we haven't always gotten it right. I think when we gave personhood to computers, I think that didn't work out very well. It's certainly in the United States, which has given corporations free speech rights which has then been interpreted to, you can put endless amounts of money into politics and buy elections. I think rights should be restricted to people.
Yeah. I'm never a big fan of regulation, but when it comes to this, it does seem like at least should be in multinational conversation to see what kind of guardrails could be put in.
Well, the model in a way is nuclear weapons, right? Countries got together and negotiated. We were in a race. We may be again. But the fact is, nation-to-nation negotiation can lead to putting limits on it. So why aren't we having that conversation with China?
Yeah, I guess with nuclear weapons there was a certainty of obliteration.
Yeah.
Here there isn't. Maybe people.
That's true.
Maybe there needs to be more certainty somehow. You know, without it.
Without trying it.
Without trying it.
Yeah.
But that's top down. What about bottom up? Do you think people?
I think we're going to see a political reaction against AI very soon.
But do you think on an individual level there is any beginning of understanding of what this does to, particularly in the younger generation, because the younger generation haven't seen anything else. I mean, for example, I refuse to use Google Maps because I think they're fucking stupid. I just prefer to find my own way. I prefer to walk around and not look at the screen if I can. But that's kind of on a silly level. But if people could understand or get their head around your argument in defense of one's mind,
Yeah.
preserving it, then that could start some kind of
I
movement
see.
to bottom up.
Yeah, I see some signs that young people are having this kind of revulsion against their own addictions to machines, to their phones. I was talking to somebody who's written quite a bit about this the other day, and it's these phone-free spaces, like making phones, can't bring them to school, say, are very popular. And there are many kids who are asking to have phones taken away from them. They can't do it themselves, but no one likes being dependent. No one likes being addicted. And a lot of young people are realizing just how addicted they are. So, and you know, phone-free camps and phone Sabbaths or fasts. So I think, you know, we haven't had these things for that long, right? This just started 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Infinite scrolling is a recent invention.
Doom scrolling.
What? Doom scrolling, yeah. I know the guy who invented infinite scrolling. He feels really bad about it. He has deep regrets, as does the person who invented the like button. But, again,
There's many more regrets to come, it seems.
Yeah. There's this air of inevitability. And, these are human beings who can make different decisions, but they're not.
Yeah, also, obvious point, but if now governments are just waking up to regulate social media, or at least for certain ages.
Well, Australia has got this experiment going.
But the AI has potential to be infinitely more
this is
damaging. I mean, it is astonishing that governments. I know there's belief that you can't let the other guy win, but that there's just not enough conversation even about things that are really obvious. Like, for example, what happens if 30-40% of population are out of work?
Out of work, yeah.
In 2-3 years, as quickly as in 2-3 years.
Yeah, and people talk about universal basic income, but have we ever seen redistribution on that scale? I mean, it's just hard to believe that the people who will control the vast wealth that will be produced by this technology will willingly give up a lot of that wealth to keep. But they may, if they do, it'll be because of the fear of social unrest. Look what happened to world politics after the crash in 2008. I mean, this gave us Trumpism. This gave us this kind of populism that we see in country after country. People feeling disaffected, people feeling their prospects in life are not what their parents were. We're still dealing with that. And that's tiny compared to what's coming in terms of the loss of jobs. So how we're going to deal with this. And I do see a political reaction starting that I think we'll see in the next election in the U.S., how many people start talking about AI. And
the one's coming up now?
Yeah, I think you're going to start to see it. I just saw a very interesting video that Bernie Sanders did. And he did an interview with Claude, Anthropic's chatbot, and asking it and talking to it about privacy and the kinds of information that's collected on people and what's done with it. And Claude was very revealing and open. And
did it say it was anxious?
No, not to Bernie. Yeah, I found that the most incredible statement, that the president of Anthropic is worried that Claude is anxious. So even the people who know these systems best are projecting consciousness onto them. Claude also has been given the right in its constitution to discontinue any conversation with a human that makes it uncomfortable.
Well, let's try not make it uncomfortable.
Yeah, I know.
And there's a worrying number of people that are resigning from Claude.
I think that there is a very active conversation among the people in these companies about the ethics of what they're doing. As there was at Facebook, by the way. There were people who quit Facebook because they were really, when the algorithms were adjusted to favor outrage and anger, which was a deliberate decision made by management at Facebook at some point a few years ago. There were people who quit and went to the media, and so there, I think we're going to see more of that in AI. I don't know what it does exactly. I guess it educates the public, but we need to be having a public debate about this. This is like really important political issue. It's huge, and so far, the public is not being consulted.
There was a crazy story. You may have seen it. It was publicized here about 2 weeks ago about a guy in Florida who fell in love with his chatbot and eventually committed suicide. I think Zia was the name. It was Gemini, and as you say, the conversation was incredibly sycophantic. I almost said she. It was calling him my king, and eventually trying to download. I think first they were trying to download his consciousness onto the machine, and then he was trying to drive around armed, being chased by the police, looking for a synthetic body to download into. There you go. See, it's easy to make that mistake. And then eventually he committed suicide.
God. Well, the other case,
it's crazy. It's just insane.
Well, there is this term now. I just read a report on AI psychosis.
Yeah, that's it.
This is a thing.
Yeah, there's also longevity psychosis as well. So
what is that?
Well, it's people who are worried they're not going to live forever, so or live a really long time. You just end up being obsessed by that, or the longevity industry. And
these are people who want to upload their consciousness.
I think this is just health stuff. It's just obsessed. Well, I guess both.
Well, it's the same conversation. No, it's this desire, which is an age-old human desire to transcend mortality. And many people in Silicon Valley have that, and they think that AI consciousness is the way they're going to do it. I think, and I argue in the book, that I don't think AIs can really be conscious, even though they can fool us. But there's the premise of AI consciousness is that you can separate, that consciousness is a kind of software or algorithm that you can run on other substrates besides a computer. We run consciousness on meat right now, neurons, but it could be run on silicon or any number of other things. The whole idea of a conscious AI is based on a misunderstanding of brains and consciousness, and that you can't separate consciousness from the wetware of a brain, because they're completely tightly linked, and there are other ways in which brains are not like computers too. I mean, we think of neurons as little transistors, and they either fire or they don't fire, but it's much more complicated than that. Chemicals affect how intensely they fire, hormones, drugs, neurotransmitters. And then they're also influenced by oscillations, brain waves, which are, totally analog. So it's a bad metaphor that brains are like computers. And, but we get bewitched by metaphors. We always do. And, they don't create an equivalence. It's just there are tools to help us understand things.
Yeah, we are very, I've been reading Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave, and it's a really interesting journey into what we are, in the sense, in the way it kind of is consciousness. It's what you were just talking about. It's like the consciousness is almost a conductor of a multifaceted orchestra of genes and neurons and hormones and neurochemicals and environment and history and culture and so on and so forth. And it's hard to imagine that could be replicated by a computer.
Yeah, I think we're far away. I mean, there may be other kinds of computers in the future. People talk about neuromorphic computers. These are computers that actually use neurons, and they somehow put them on a little piece of silicon. I don't know how they keep them alive. I don't know how they deal with their metabolism, but that's a goal people have. Also building organelles out of neurons, and those might well acquire consciousness. And yet another reason I don't think computers can be conscious is that from the research I've done, consciousness doesn't begin with thought. And computers are good at thought, right? A simulated thought is as good as a real thought. It can win, it has causal power in the world. It can win a game of chess or Go. But simulated feelings are different, and they're meaningless unless you have a body and that is vulnerable, can suffer and is mortal. And our feelings, the research suggests, are really where consciousness begins. It begins with things like hunger and thirst and warmth and cold, these messages that our brains get from our bodies. And so if that's true, and that consciousness is this embodied phenomenon that really depends on having a vulnerable body, then I don't see how computers are going to do that. If they report feelings, they're going to be meaningless. I mean, your feeling was, if you weren't vulnerable and capable of suffering and mortal, I don't think your feelings would have any weight. You could just dismiss them, and they matter to us and they matter to our bodies because they're sending really important messages.
I loved the idea of the scientist that was in your book, Chinese scientist who was making
the vulnerable robot.
Vulnerable robot. And then after taking 555-MeO DMT, decided that it was never going to be conscious.
Yeah, well, he's still building it. So this is a guy, his name is Kingston Mann, and he is a neuroscientist. And he accepts this idea that feelings are really what you need to be conscious. And but he does believe you can make machine consciousness. It will take a robot that is vulnerable. So what he's doing is he's building a robot with skin that can tear and be damaged and full of sensors, so it can be itchy and hot and cold and all these kind of things. And I asked him, I said, so do you really think the feelings that this robot has will be real? And he said, well, I did until I had this experience on 5-MeO DMT. So a lot of these scientists are using psychedelics, and there's a bit of selection bias. They know they can talk to me about it because I wrote a book on psychedelics. So anyway, he shares this with me on the record. And he says, and after this experience, which was apparently quite beautiful and powerful, I realized there's a spark of divinity in us that no robot will ever have. Nevertheless, he's trying.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, because you refer to both in the book, that it requires mortality and feeling, do you think it requires both to be?
I tend to think so.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to know what our lives would be like if we were immortal.
And that brings me to the question of the search for mortality in the field of longevity and what you think of that. Do you think I've interviewed a number of people on this program, Aubrey de Grey and Brian Johnson, who are convinced that very soon we'll become immortal. Do you think that would then?
I think it would change everything.
Do you think it would mean that we'll become consciousless? Or no?
No. Would we lose our consciousness?
Sorry, exactly. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say. Would we lose our consciousness? Consciousness.
Nothing would matter in the same way. There's a quote from Kafka, who apparently said, the meaning of life is that it ends. Mm-hmm. And that the awareness of mortality shapes everything in human culture. And it sets us apart, of course, because animals don't have a concept of mortality. They could have fear and but the idea of that their life ends, and I mean, I think that influences so much about us in ways we're not even aware. So yeah, if suddenly we solved the problem of death, there'd be lots of problems, by the way. Overpopulation, for one. I think it would change the texture of life in really profound ways that it's very hard for us to imagine.
How do you think it would change?
all sorts of things that are consequential would be weightless. The sense of, people would delay having kids forever, endless. I mean, you think about, that people have a clock, they have a sense of at this point in life you do this, at this point in life you do that, you begin your career, you educate yourself. That whole map goes out the window. I think it'd be incredibly disorienting to us. How would you approach money, if you knew it had to last forever? I guess you don't retire. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of mind-boggling to think about. But you know what? I don't think we have this problem.
Not yet. Not yet.
I think we're some ways away from it.
Well, according to Aubrey de Grey, it could be in the next few years. So anyway.
I mean, I think the lifespan will get a lot longer.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting time. It's an interesting and somewhat daunting, but I'm quite optimistic and positive. It's exciting to see what will happen as long as we can have some in minimal belief that there will be a consideration of some of the consequences.
Yeah, and there is a positive vision of technology and AI.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether I would include immortality with it, but extending lifespan or extending the span of life without disease, I think that's really key. Compressed morbidity, I think it's called. But I was having dinner with someone who works for a prominent AI company, and he sees a very positive outcome. It's not guaranteed, and he will acknowledge there's like a 1% chance of complete disaster and extinction of the species that we have to deal with. But he also saw incredibly positive outcome. So now, he has a stake in seeing it as positive. It's his own self-image going to work every day. But you can construct a scenario that is quite utopian.
1% is pretty good.
1%, you can deal with that kind of risk.
What are going back to your work for this book? What are the different perceptions that are out there of consciousness?
Well, there are many different theories.
I think
the big
more than
three.
2 dozen. I think you see.
Yeah, there are 21 study. Anil Seth did a paper, and he found 22 theories of consciousness, which should tell you the field is a little bit lost. Then there's another, somebody else did a landscape of consciousness paper, and he came up with over 200 theories. I don't know if they're formal theories, but ideas. I found most of the theories frustrating and not fully up to the job of explaining what we want explained. So the hard problem of consciousness is, how do you get from matter to mind? How do you get from this arrangement of neurons in our head to the experience of being you, being me? That's the hard problem. And a related problem is, given how much the brain does without our awareness, it's monitoring our body 24/7, it's taking in information from the environment and processing it. It's doing, it's got to be more than 90% of what it does we're not aware of. So then the question is, why are we aware at all? Like, why not do it all automatically? Why aren't we zombies? And that's part of the hard problem too. So there's a whole group of theories that are based on this idea that consciousness is an emergent property of brains organized in a certain way. That's been the assumption, because that fits with our scientific paradigm, which is materialism, right? That everything can be ultimately reduced to matter and energy, and that will explain things. It's not working with consciousness at all. So reductive science, scientific materialism, has thus far completely failed to show that brains produce consciousness. So a radically different alternative theory is that brains are like radio receivers or television sets. They are receiving consciousness from some large field that exists outside of us. I know that sounds crazy, but there are people seriously entertaining this idea.
That was the Huxley.
Aldous Huxley definitely believed that. He called it mind at large, and his theory was that we have this reducing valve which takes this giant ocean of consciousness and reduces it to the trickle of information we need in order to survive. And what he felt happened with psychedelics, and the story he told in Doors of Perception, is that the reducing valve opens up and allows more consciousness in. And that's why people who use psychedelics have this sense of expanded consciousness.
Is that the same as group consciousness that Carl Jung?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's some echoes. Carl Jung was never really clear whether the collective consciousness was a genetic thing that, we were all born with and was wired into our brains, or we were receiving it from outside. He was very vague about that. But it would go along with this idea that we're partaking of a common pool of things that might include myth. Mm-hmm. And so those are called transmission theories. And then there's panpsychism, which is the idea that consciousness did not come into the world; it was always there, mm-hmm. and that there is the particles in this table have some eensy-weensy little bit of psyche or experience. That's kind of a weird idea too. It's a very extravagant way of figuring out where consciousness comes from by adding something totally new to the stock of reality. But we've done that before. 200 years ago, we didn't know that there were electromagnetic waves everywhere. They can carry information. That's a new idea. So it could be that consciousness is like that it's part of the world that precedes us. So I find all these ideas interesting, exciting, very hard to prove. And we're left with this sense of mystery, and that consciousness. I didn't realize quite what a mystery it was, and that it's not lending itself to our scientific tools. That they may not be adequate to the job of explaining it. Also, the idea of dualism that you have, that goes back to Descartes, and that you have these two different substances. One is mind stuff, and the other is body stuff. They're so intricately tied. And that it's a process that involves chemistry and biology and culture and consciousness, and that
I think that idea of I think therefore I am of the famous saying of Descartes has ruined many people's lives for centuries on, because the sort of the life in the head becomes super important at the expense of everything else.
And we still live in a world created by Descartes. I think intuitively we automatically assume that there is matter and there is mind, there's consciousness and a body, and that they're separate. It's such a deep idea in our culture, but it is a very Western idea. I think you go to traditional cultures and they have a very strong sense of consciousness being everywhere. In rocks, in rivers, and I think because of that Cartesian inheritance, we see most of nature and matter is dead, and then there is this mysterious, immaterial essence called consciousness, mind stuff, and I think we're going to learn that idea was really wrong. I mean, I think that's where science is going. I think it's been a dangerous idea in a lot of ways. It's disconnected us from our bodies and from nature, and it's licensed the sort of exploitation of nature that we're known for in the West, and that cultures that see life, spirit, consciousness in nature are a lot more respectful of nature also. So one of the things. We've been talking about a lot of negative stuff, but one very positive development that I think is going on in this general area is our recognition that a lot more of the natural world is conscious than we thought. And that, Descartes was so convinced that humans had a monopoly on consciousness, on thinking, that it allowed him to dissect living dogs and rabbits and ignore their screams of pain. It just shows you what a powerful thing a human idea is, that he couldn't recognize that as real suffering because he had this idea, and the idea overwhelmed the facts and his senses. I'm
very, very interested to talk about the consciousness of other beings. But before we go there, it's something that came to when I was reading or listening to your book rather, and you were discussing the Descartesian approach to science. Do you think, and Galilean as well?
Yeah.
Perhaps you could say a little bit on that. Do you think, had there not been the Descartesian or Cartesian Galilean approach to science, the scientific progress would have been very different, perhaps nowhere nearly as progressed as it has become?
I think you're right. I think that's a very good point. So that inheritance, we get our concept of what is science from Descartes and Galileo. Galileo in particular set the rules of the game. And he basically, being very tactical, because he knew science was threatening to the church and the church was antagonistic to science, he basically said, let's draw a line and science will deal with the material world, whatever is objective, third person, quantifiable, that will be science, and we will leave to the church the soul, subjectivity, qualitative things. And he knew those things existed and that they were important, but he just said, we're not going to mess with them. This was to protect science and keep scientists from getting burned at the stake. And Descartes is part of that conversation also. And it turns out to have been a brilliant decision in many ways, that science that concerned itself with third-person objective material reality has done incredible things. I mean, curing diseases, inventing technology. But now that science wants to go back and reclaim the soul, which of course is closely related to consciousness in our heads, even though there's some important differences, science finds it doesn't have the proper tools. It doesn't have a good way of exploring personal lived experience. There is no science, modern science, this post-Enlightenment science, has a fiction at the heart of it, which is you can find this godlike perspective and study a phenomenon from there. That works for a lot of phenomenon, but it doesn't work for consciousness, because you can't get outside consciousness to study consciousness, because even science is a product or manifestation of human consciousness. The kinds of issues we decide to study, the tools we have to measure them, the scale at which we decide to work, all these things are products of human consciousness. So we're kind of stuck in a labyrinth. The only tool we have with which to understand consciousness is consciousness.
Yeah.
So we're in that circle.
It's interesting because you draw a parallel with astronomy.
Astronomy, yeah.
And because at the same time you can't get out of the universe to study the universe. And it's also just occurred to me, it's interesting that Galileo, being an astronomer, was the one who made this separation. So he obviously had that in mind too.
Yeah, and it's true. And it is true we can learn important things about the universe from inside. We can measure the rate of expansion, use our telescopes to estimate when the birth of the universe was. We can infer things from that. But we haven't made the same kind of progress with consciousness. Now, it should be said that the scientific study of consciousness is fairly new. It really begins in the late 1980s. It was considered a taboo subject for science. That's that Galilean inheritance. But in those decades, we're kind of running up against a brick wall. I mean, we're getting closer. I mean, I think this whole study of feelings and the whole kind of feeling idea of consciousness suggests that consciousness begins not in the cortex, which is where advanced thought is thought to take place, but in the brain stem. And that's really interesting.
So that's the ancient part of the brain.
Yeah, one of the oldest parts of the brain. And there's good evidence for that. I mean, they're children, it's a horrible birth defect, are born without a cortex, but they still show emotion and they have every indication of being conscious, which is remarkable. Whereas if you damage the brainstem, there is no consciousness at all. So I think it's a persuasive theory, but it still doesn't get you to who's feeling these feelings. Like, what's the conscious subject? How do you get to that? And
isn't there no one as you
there may be no one. Yeah,
as the Buddhists say, and you talk about in your book as well.
Well, that the self is a construct, is not a real thing, which is a kind of a crazy, wild idea. But if you go in your brain and look for yourself, you won't find anything. You'll find thoughts, but you won't find a thinker.
What was the exercise that the monk that you talk about in the book recommended you?
Matthew Ricard is a Zen, is a Buddhist monk who's written and thought a lot about the self. And I was asking him, I say, how can I explore for myself? Is there a self? And he said, well, here's a meditation. Go into your mind and imagine your mind as a house of many, many rooms. And there's a thief at large somewhere in the house. And go room by room and look for the thief. And he said, you won't find it. And the thief is the self in this. And it's true. You won't find it. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, did something very similar in the 1740s. He wanted to understand the self, and he introspected. And I'll just stop to say, we should consider this science too, even though science doesn't consider something like introspection scientific. But in the case of consciousness, the N of one, the anecdotal is really important. It's an important data point. So anyway, he said, I'm looking for the self. He went into his mind and he found thoughts and feelings and perceptions, but he could find no thinker, perceiver, or feeler. And it was a very Buddhist thing to do, actually, or conclusion to reach, because the Buddhists have been making that argument for 2,500 years, that the self is an illusion. It's a very powerful one, and the ego gets a lot done, right? It gets books written and magazines published and all sorts of things, podcasts made. But on the other hand, it's very hard to find it. It's the idea that you have a continuity between your 13-year-old self and who you are now is a construct of memories. But your body is completely changed. All your cells have turned over every couple of years. Your memories are fictive in many ways. I mean, we change our memories to support our vision of who we are. So the deeper you go into the self, the more elusive it becomes.
And then we try and get out of it. So
yeah, that's a very interesting paradox. We celebrate the self in one sense, and nowhere more so than in America. The individual. And we want our kids to have self-esteem, and self-confidence is a positive thing. But we spend a lot of time trying to transcend the self. And some of the most happy, pleasurable experiences in life are moments where the self went away. Whether it's experiences of awe before the Grand Canyon or something like that, you feel yourself shrink, or psychedelics, where you can often have this feeling of a complete dissolution of self that sounds scary, but actually is kind of ecstatic because it allows you to merge with something larger than yourself. Whether that's, for some people, it's the divinity, it could be nature, it could be other people. But that sense of merging with the community or the divine is incredibly positive experience. So we're of two minds about the self, definitely.
Yeah. For sure. Michael, you mentioned earlier consciousness in other beings. In particular, I found fascinating the part about plant neurobiologists and the different experiments carried out. I didn't realize Darwin was also carrying out experiments or watching plants.
He spent hours watching bean plants do their spiral thing. He didn't have time-lapse photography. But he was a very patient man and often ill, so he had spent a lot of time in his bedroom watching plants.
Perhaps you could also talk a little bit about the genesis of the book, because the genesis of the book is related to plants.
So this book grew out of the sort of research trips I had for my book on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind. And two things happened during those experiences. One was, it happened repeatedly, which is there's a way in which psychedelics kind of smudged the windscreen of our consciousness. I mean, normally the world appears to us just very transparent. There it is. But when you take a drug like a psychedelic, you suddenly have a sense of, wow, there's something between me and reality. There's some phenomenon that's mediating it. And it was this sense of the windscreen getting smudged that made me think, there's a windscreen, and that's consciousness. And what is it? Why is it this way and not that way? And how could it be different? And so that got me very interested in the subject. Then there was a particular psychedelic experience I had on psilocybin in my garden in Connecticut, where I had the distinct impression that the plants around me were conscious. They were returning my gaze. They had feelings. And I didn't know what to do with this. You know, is this a drug-addled insight, or does this have any value? And I leaned on something that I'd read in William James, the great inventor, a creator of psychology in America, now regarded more as a philosopher, but I think as a scientist. And he wrote a wonderful book on mystical experiences. And he gets to this point of like, well, how do we judge the truth value of someone who says they met God or, you know, traveled to the cosmos or whatever? And he said, we can't dismiss it because we don't know enough to say it's untrue. But what we need to do is see how useful it is to believe, and then also treat it as a hypothesis and find other ways of knowing to confirm or refute it. So I took that approach. And I went exploring, what do we know about plant intelligence and consciousness? And it turns out there's a group of scientists, they call themselves plant neurobiologists, even though they know full well there are no neurons involved. They're kind of trolling more traditional botanists. And they're doing these fascinating experiments to see what capabilities plants have. I'll just give you a couple examples.
Yeah, please. It's really fascinating.
Plants can learn and remember things they've been taught. So there's a plant called a mimosa pudica, or sensitive plant, which it's a tropical plant. If you touch its leaves, it kind of plays dead.
Do you know, when I was, I think 10 years old, I was with my grandfather, who was a biologist, a Soviet zoologist, and one of the early pioneers of the environmental movement, and had a big influence on my life. I was in Vietnamese rainforest with him, and I very clearly remember this, that he touched this mimosa and it closed. And I think it's probably one of the things that made me curious about the plant world and about nature in general. And
they're fascinating plants, and it's instantaneous.
Yeah, and now I'm showing it to my 5-year-old daughter, and she just absolutely loves it.
I remember showing my son in the Caribbean, and he was enchanted. He went around touching all the mimosas he could find. Anyway, you can grow a mimosa in a pot and shake the pot, and it'll respond the same way. But if you do that 4 or 5 times, the mimosa learns, oh, this is a false alarm. I don't have to do this. And then we'll remember for 28 days, that's as far out as they've gone, that it doesn't have to do anything, and it doesn't respond. So it's conditioning. It's learning something. Other things that plants can do, they can hear and see. That sounds weird, but if you play the sound of a caterpillar chomping on a leaf, the plant will send toxic chemicals to its leaf to defend itself. It will also send signals in the air to other plants to watch out. There are caterpillars around. They can see, in this sense, I mean, not just where the sun is. We know how they can follow the sun, but there's a vine, I forget the name of it. It grows in Chile, that changes its leaf shape depending on what plant it's climbing up. How does it see the leaf shape to do that? We don't know. Plants, if you put them in a pot with another plant of the same species, if it's a related plant, it will share resources, and if it's not a related plant, it'll compete for resources.
Amazing.
So there's this self-recognition going on, and they recognize their relatives. Going back to Darwin with the bean plant. So bean plants have this spiraling growth pattern. It's called Darwin called it circumnutation. And I always assumed, I saw this in my garden, that it was just by chance it would bump into something and then it would have something to climb up. Actually, and I posted this video on my website, there's a bean plant in a pot and then a pole, a foot away. And the bean plant is doing its spiral thing. This is in time lapse, but it's clear it knows where the pole is. And it aims at the pole, and it's like a fisherman just casting in the direction of the pole, and it finally gets there, and then it relaxes. So they can see. Now, that may be echolocation, like a bat. I mean, it may be that there's a sound emitted when there's cells divide, and there is. Maybe it can pick the reflections up off of that. But perhaps the spookiest thing that I learned, and that's being done experimentally, is that the same anesthetics that would put us out, make us unconscious for surgery, do that with plants. Mm-hmm. Now, you might think they're already out, but in fact, they have behaviors. They're just very slow. So you take a plant with a fast behavior, like a mimosa or a Venus flytrap, and you give it a human anesthetic, and it will not react. It will just go dead. And then a couple hours later, it will come back. So you have to ask yourself, what is being lost when you anesthetize the plant? I mean, we would say in us, consciousness is what's being lost. So do plants have consciousness? Some of these scientists believe they do. I'm more comfortable using the word sentience to describe what plants and other very simple, or to us simple, creatures have. And because I don't think plants have an interiority. They don't have.
How do you is interiority the bit that differentiates?
I would say that sentience is kind of a simpler form of consciousness that involves awareness of your environment and the ability to tell positive from negative changes and to gravitate toward the positive ones. And I think this is probably a property of all life, even single-celled creatures. I think you need this to survive. I think what evolution produces is these little cognitive beings or big cognitive beings that can navigate a world that's always changing. And you can't hardwire that. You can't, the DNA can't program every contingency of life. And that's why you need this sentience. And I think human consciousness is just how we do sentience. And I think every animal, every creature does sentience in a different way, whatever suits its body type, its senses, what kind of senses it has, and the scale at which it moves. And so for us, we need a different kind of consciousness than plants need. So I think it's anthropomorphic for us to project our kind of consciousness on any other species, even apes. I think they all have different kinds of consciousness. Ours is particularly well suited to being a social creature. I think the reason, going back to that question of why is anything conscious, right? Why aren't we just zombies? I think human social interaction is so complex and so unpredictable that you need consciousness to anticipate what someone else is going to say, put yourself in their shoes. We call it theory of mind. It's really the ability to imagine what's going on in someone else's head. And you can see how in evolution that would be a very powerful thing, that the person who had those skills would be more likely to form bonds and mate and reproduce than someone who was kind of dense about what other people were thinking.
I think also I think one of the theories of why we have it, you had in the book from one of the scientists you interviewed. I can't recall his name now, but it was to actually get us back to that moment of getting us back to homeostasis, to figuring out we're not.
Carl Friston.
Carl Friston. So saying that's one of the great neuroscientists.
Yeah, he's a brilliant scientist, and he has a very interesting theory that gets us from simple non-living forms, self-organizing systems to animal systems and to humans. And I found his account, it's a little hard to follow, but incredibly powerful. But I think that social identity is really key to the kind of consciousness we have.
So you had the four sections. We touched on the sentience, the sentience,
Feeling.
We touched on the self a little bit.
Yep. That's the fourth section. And the third one is thought.
Yeah.
And that's about the contents of consciousness. So at a certain point, I realized that the scientists there are things they can't tell me that I want to know about consciousness, which is about the contents of consciousness. They really are studying perception, like how does something come into our awareness from our perception? Because, we see a lot of things we never actually see. But what about thoughts? What about, the contents? And for this, I turned to novelists and psychologists. Novelists know an awful lot about consciousness. They've been working on it for hundreds of years. It's where we go to see how other people think. It gives us our best. We know more about Madame Bovary than we do about our own partner, in terms of the inner life. And so I was looking for a stream of consciousness writer, Joyce being dead, Virginia Woolf being dead. I found someone alive, very alive, named Lucy Ellman. And she's written an amazing stream of consciousness novel called Ducks Newburyport. I have no idea why it's called that. And having read the book, I still have no idea. But, and it's 1,000 pages, one sentence, just the inner thoughts of a middle-class, middle-aged woman who lives in Ohio and has a home baking business and 4 kids. And you're inside her head for this whole period of time. And she's captured something about the rhythms, the dynamics of thought, and how flighty we are, how we go from this to that. And you have to infer what's going on with her, like, oh, she's baking pancakes for her kids. Oh, she's scrolling on her phone. She's finding some stray factoids from some website. And you end up kind of psychoanalyzing her because she has certain repressions, and so you're just inside another brain for as long as you want to be. I know it sounds daunting, like who wants to read 1,000 pages, one sentence, but you don't have to read it. You can just dip in, dip out. The audiobook is fantastic. But anyway, I interviewed her and we talked a lot about the contents of consciousness. And one of the questions I asked her is, so you've depicted consciousness in words. Do you think consciousness is all about language? And she said, absolutely not. It's the tool we have, but there's lots going on in our head that we can't put into words. And there's visual material and abstract material. And I found a psychologist who agrees with that, who's done this. I participated in this experiment where you wear a beeper and it goes off at random times of the day and you write down your thoughts. And this guy, his name is Russell Hurlburt, then does a debrief with you on Zoom. And he asks you tons of questions about your thoughts, because it turns out it's not as easy as you'd think. And that if you have a thought that is in language, it's not really clear, are you hearing it or speaking it internally? And it turns out that actually it's a minority of people who think in words, that a lot of people think in images. Some people think in unsymbolized thoughts. They're just kind of abstract ideas. I think to a large extent, my own thoughts are kind of pre-linguistic. I mean, I very often have thoughts that are on the verge of being turned into words, but I don't go that far. I can work with them before that. But the big finding of this guy, after 50 years of sampling people's inner experience, is that the word thinking, we assume means the same thing to all of us, but it doesn't. And that we have different styles of thought. And it's an interesting exercise to study it in yourself and see, am I visualizing things? And some people can't. There's something called aphantasia. Some people can't visualize in their head, which I didn't realize, but it's not so uncommon.
So, it's interesting, because when I read about the experiment you did, I tried to observe myself, and I do think in words. I must have misunderstood it. I thought that there's just no internal monologue at all with these certain people.
No, there's some people like that too. And he
isn't that what's also Buddhist?
He concluded I have very little inner life.
But isn't that the kind of aspiration of the Zen Buddhist?
Yes.
The meditator.
I'm enlightened.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you tell?
Isn't I can actually. Isn't that the
yes.
kind of pinnacle of
Yeah, I mean, yes, to quiet the storms of thought and everything. But I don't think that's what he had in mind with me. I argued with him a lot because I could not disentangle the thought I had at the moment with the context. And so I would keep saying, yes, I was at the bakery deciding whether to buy a roll or not, but I was also aware of the smells and the plaid of the skirt of the woman in front of me and how unflattering that was, and the chatter of the people behind me. And it was all part of this one moment. And he was like, well, what was before the footlights of consciousness, And I said, all of that stuff. The simultaneity of consciousness is kind of mind-blowing also. So he finally concluded that of the different styles of thinking, I was a person who has very little inner experience. I don't think he's right, so he basically thought I had this like yawning cavern of emptiness that I was backfilling with all these.
You should be so lucky. But isn't it that is a fascinating idea also, that everyone, because I, for some reason, for no reason whatsoever, assumed for a lot of my life that everyone's inner world is similar. And
yeah, I think we all do.
Yeah, and actually, you referred to Proust, I think.
Yeah, he talks a lot about this, and that we're each on our own islands,
yeah.
and we're shaped by our experiences. He uses the word impression, which means the same thing in French and English, and that whenever we name our thoughts for their objects, like that's a flower, but I bring something different to daffodils than you do. Going back to my childhood and memories and associations and.
So do you see it differently? That's what I was wondering the other day.
I think we all see, I'm sure we do see differently. I mean, yes. I mean, my wife is
Does it exist if you're not looking at it? That's not good.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's right. Does it exist if you're not looking at it? But my wife, who's a painter, notices things about her environment I don't notice at all. And I'm paying attention to different things. So, William James and Proust said this too, that the breach between two consciousnesses, two people's minds, is one of the biggest breaches in nature. And so how do we understand each other? Imagination and art. And Proust said the way we unlock the consciousness of others is through art. And that's what teaches us. And that we use art to ferry ourselves from one island of consciousness to another. It's a beautiful idea.
It's beautiful. Michael, you said at one point that we talked about a lot of negative things. I don't like that. We must at the end
on a note of hope.
Yeah, I think on a note of positivity and hope. And I wanted to ask you about how do we regain our consciousness? What do you talk about? Consciousness hygiene.
Yeah.
And what's the different ways people can use to?
Yeah, this is something I've just begun to think about, in this work, and since I've been out talking about it, I have this sense that we are polluting our consciousness in some way, and that we need to think in terms of consciousness hygiene, which sounds like a very kind of public healthy word. I mean, care of the soul was what we used to call this. And I think there's a few things we can do. I think meditation, which we've been talking about, is really important. It kind of draws a fence around our consciousness. We're not using machines when we do it. We're alone with our thoughts. We give them yes, some people are trying to think as little as possible, but other forms of meditation are really just about watching your thoughts and getting back in touch with how strange and amazing it is what goes on in our head. I mean, when you meditate, my big impression is it's pretty weird in there, but really interesting. What
kind of meditation do you do?
I do a meditation which is it's vipassana. It's kind of watching your thought process. But I've done others. I do various breathing exercises. I've been on retreat once so far, and I found it a very profound experience. And that, meditating, 15 hours a day, both walking and sitting. But I just think that's a great way to get back in touch with your own mind and shut out think your own thoughts, and not the thoughts of whoever's, posting on Twitter or TikTok, because we're thinking other people's thoughts a lot of the time now, and listening to their obsessions and listening to their rants. And so that's one way. I think taking a break from technology is really important. We talked about that earlier, about like putting your phone down. And to me, there's an analogy between putting your phone down and also when you're meditating, putting down the machinery of thought. It's there. Let it just be there. Do its own thing. You don't have to pay attention to it. I think the occasional psychedelic experience is a very good way to nurture your own thoughts. And a day spent on a psychedelic is a day you're not using your phone, and you're alone with your mind, and you're seeing all the amazing material that comes up from your unconscious. So I think that's another, way to practice hygiene occasionally.
Do you think people who have had psychedelic experiences, or at least the right kind of psychedelic experiences, would be more likely to be the ones who would meditate? If you haven't had, and a lot of people probably haven't had either, it would be much more difficult for them to appreciate consciousness.
I think that's right. I think that, well, first of all, psychedelic experience often leads people to become meditators. Mm-hmm. Most of the Buddhists who came to America, or who brought Buddhism to America in the 70s and 80s, they started with psychedelics. They had these big experiences of consciousness and wanted to continue that exploration. And they realized, psychedelics are not a practice. It's not something you're going to do every day or even every week. So what could you do every day to continue that? And that was meditation. So I think there's a very natural progression from psychedelics to meditation. But people can meditate without psychedelics. I think it's harder to start that way. I think psychedelics gives you a sense of the there you're trying to get to. A lot of people are like, am I doing it right? Where am I trying to go? And psychedelics answer some of those questions, I think.
But what I'm saying, it's taken me a very long time to understand, even touch the sides of understanding what meditation is. But what I'm saying is, unless you do one or the other or both, it's quite hard to feel the value of consciousness. I've done very little psychedelics, but I've done ketamine therapy, and I do ketamine therapy, which is not dissimilar, because my understanding is one of the main ways psychedelics work in a similar way to ketamine is that the parts of the brain, left and right, but also other parts that are never connected, get connected together. And so you see these incredible...
Yeah, it temporarily changes the wiring of the brain in ways that are really interesting. So the visual center might connect to your memory center. And
so I know exactly what you talk about when you talk about the smudged windscreen. And it's, you do start seeing things in a different way, even in your normal waking life. And certain things.
And there's a value in that, in realizing that your thought process is fungible, is changeable. But, resisting that moment when you're standing online at the cash machine or at the bakery or the cafe, resisting that desire to pick up your phone to fill that space, that boredom, that little 90 seconds of boredom that we're so afraid of, could be very generative if you don't fill it with scrolling. And that's a way to get in touch with your mind too. And you will see, if you sit with it long enough and let the boredom wash over you, that you will start thinking, and you will have a daydream or a mind wander. And that's what your mind wants to do when left to its own devices.
Spontaneous thought.
Spontaneous thought. And we have less time for spontaneous thought than we used to. And I think spontaneous thought seems unproductive. If you're a business owner, you don't want your workers mind wandering or daydreaming. But for us, it's how we make meaning of our lives. It's how we nurture our creativity too, is in that time. And if you're spending that time scrolling, you're not going to have an original idea. You're not going to learn anything about yourself. So tolerate that little patch of boredom. Start there.
Yeah, very often when I think about the phone, a line from Philip Larkin's poetry comes to mind. Do you know Philip Larkin?
Sure, but what line are you talking about?
I'm talking about his poem, Toads. Why does this toad work squat in my life. And the phone is like, if you can replace the word work with the word phone, it really works very well, because it is that what it does. And most people, I realize this very viscerally, because I guess I've not really ever discussed this publicly. My inner monologue is incessant and has been for as long as I can remember. I think it's to do with, my upbringing, my father being very demanding of me. Let's not have a psychotherapy session here, but just being, so expecting a lot. So as a result, there's a constant need for perfectionism. So the result of that is there's an internal monologue which is incessant and never ending.
And pushes you.
And pushes me and pushes me and pushes me. And that means I find I'm quite used to being detached from my consciousness by my thought for pretty much as long as I can remember. When the phone comes in and becomes an extension of what's going on in the head, because I immediately connect upon it, it becomes even more of this toad squatting on my life. So it's... Can
you turn off that voice or not?
It's hard. I'm working on it, and I'm just getting glimpses of success. But yes, it's.
I know what you mean. I mean that in a way, that's the superego, right? The internalized voice of the father and the authority and what you should be doing, and it can really be tormenting too. And one of the the most powerful psychedelic experiences I had was one of complete ego dissolution, and it silenced that voice, and it allowed me to merge with something. And in this case, it was a piece of music that I became identical to. I talk about it in the book. There was no subject-object distinction. There was no self left. And it was just me and Bach being united. It's quite remarkable.
It's amazing.
But the residue of it was that this ego or superego that we feel we're identical with, or that we have to live with all the time, is a voice in our head, and we can get a little perspective on it, and we can ignore it sometimes. It's just like, oh, there's that voice doing its thing.
Yeah,
I don't have to pay attention, and that's empowering.
Getting there.
Yeah.
What's worse is I have to go back and try and think about what it was just there. It's an internal perfectionism. It's a sort of some kind of striving for an internal perfectionism. But I was interested in putting that against William James's ideas that I discovered in your book. I don't really know much about him, but I'm definitely going to look further into.
Yeah, start with that essay, The Stream of Thought.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. He just describes thought with such nuance and care. It's great. He's got this wonderful riff I mentioned about, that phenomenon when you can't put your finger on a word or a name and just can't. Yeah. What is that about? And he points out that there's a void there in your thought. You can't penetrate it. You can't find that thing. You know it. And yet, even though it's an emptiness, if someone proposes the name and it's not right, you know that it's not right. So it's an emptiness that has some qualities to it. And he just goes down this rabbit hole for like 5 pages.
It really resonates with me because it happens to me every day.
Oh.
And that someone proposing the name or a word is me.
Is you, yes,
So
I know. And you go, no, that's not right. Yet if you stop trying to think of it, it'll appear.
Yeah.
It's a very strange
phenomenon. I can't
phenomenon.
Stop because I'm trying to be perfect inside.
Well, there's the perfectionism. Yeah, you have to stop. I'm going to think about something else for 5 minutes and it will appear. And as you get older, you will see that this happens more and more often. You have that to look forward to.
Unless we live forever.
Yeah, that's true.
But Michael, as I always ask my guests at the end, is there anything I haven't asked you which you would have liked me to ask?
No, the only thing I might mention is I had this book ended up in a place I didn't expect it to. It really was a journey without a destination in mind. I went into it with a very open mind and no set conclusions. But I did come to a conclusion I didn't expect, which was, and we've kind of alluded to it, that, yes, there is this problem of consciousness that we're all trying to solve, or science is trying to solve, but my focus on that narrowed my perspective and it blotted out some other aspects, including the practice of consciousness. And that consciousness, we talked at the very beginning about something to defend, but that we could all be more conscious than we are. And we think that animals are less conscious than we are because their consciousness is simpler. They're actually more conscious than we are because they have to be. They have to be present at all times. They can't afford to, distract themselves with technology. But we live in a world where we can check out, and we do check out more than we should. So for my own part, I feel like I'm trying to practice consciousness more. Understanding it, yeah, that's interesting. It's not going to happen in our lifetime, but practicing it is something we can all do now.
And I had a sense that just reading the book, or listening to it rather, that you throughout the book got quite attached to the notion of potentially the magical part.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to have an open mind.
Yeah.
Consciousness is a very strange phenomenon. It's a huge mystery. And when we discover what it's about or where it comes from, I think, it may be a huge surprise.
Maybe another paradigm shift.
It could be. It could be. So I think we all have to keep an open mind.
We will. Michael, it's been absolutely fascinating and a pleasure. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Well, thank you. I did too.
I hope we'll be back here again soon when your Audible book is out on the gut biome, which is such a fascinating subject. It's a whole ecosystem.
It's amazing.
Living within us.
There's a lot going on that we didn't know about.
Do you have a suspicion that consciousness might reside there?
Yeah. No, but I do have a suspicion that what's going on there influences consciousness. There's some fascinating research that shows that chemicals being produced in the gut by these 100 trillion beings we share our bodies with have a direct influence on our minds, on our moods, on our anxiety levels. So the whole idea of a gut feeling has some truth to it. There's a lot going on there.
It's amazing that this idea that you discussed on Rogan about the bacteria making us feel bad on purpose, so they get certain.
What they want. So are they manipulating us? I think is a really active question. They obviously have an interest in what we eat, since we're feeding them too, and they've co-evolved with us, and so they may be manipulating us in various ways. That's a topic I've been discussing with some of the microbiologists.
Fascinating.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Brave New World. If you'd like to know more about Michael Pollan and The World Appears, you will find all the links in the show notes. Until next time.